So let's call the meeting to order. This is the May 31st special meeting of the City Council Rail Committee. And would the clerk like to call the roll?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Chair Berman.
Here.
Mayor Burt.
Here.
Councilmember Du Bois.
Here.
Vice Mayor Scharf.
Here.
4 present.
Yeah, and that goes. Thank you very much. And just so colleagues know, I think we have the mics that you have to hit the button when you want to speak. The first item on the agenda is the city's response to high-speed rail notice of EIR preparation, which is continued from our meeting last Wednesday morning on May 25th. I have two members of the public who would, the first item is oral communications. There aren't any members of the public who want to speak to oral communications, so we'll close that item and then move on to the city's response to high-speed rail notice of EIR. And we have two members of the public who'd like to speak to that. The first is William Brenegar. And can you pass me the clock? Thank you. And William, you'll have 3 minutes. If you just come up to this microphone right here, that'd be great.
Mr. Mayor, Vice Mayor, honored council members. I'm here because we have to stop this insanity. This has been nothing but a political payoff for the Schwarzenegger campaign and unfortunately Jerry Brown. We're going to have to, put up with 10 years or whatever, how long it takes him to build something that is not useful. The letter, I agree with the gentleman. You'll have to load that train 24 hours a day, both ways, to even make a budget. So I don't know of 10,000 people that want to ride a train every day down to L.A. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't think there's 10,000 people in L.A. that want to ride every day. So, the scar that this thing is going to put on our peninsula, these electrical wires hanging, it kind of makes me think of Nazi Germany with the rail there. So all I'm asking, I know y'all are fighting this and doing the best you can, but I just want to encourage you to do whatever we can to stop this nonsense, because I'm going to be honest with you, I'm not riding down to Bakersfield in a train, and I'm not riding down to L.A. in a train, and I don't think most of the people here are going to ride in a train. It's too long. It's silly. We would have to have parking lots at all these places that, what are we going to do, fill them up with parking decks? That'll look nice. I know everybody's fired up about that. And then they don't want to even put it in a trench or put it in a tunnel. They want us to see this every 3 minutes. It's just not right, and it's, like I said, it's just a political boondoggle that it made some people a job and some money. They had no intent to ever complete this and do not. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker will be Herb Borak. Yeah, for item number 1. And you'll have 3 minutes.
Yeah, Chair Berman and committee members, the staff report for this agenda item at the end says that the content, length, and tone of the city's letter will contribute to its effectiveness. And so for guidance on the content, length, and tone of the letter, I went to the guidelines for the California Environmental Quality Act for the notice of preparation and determinations of scope of EIR. And although this is directed at responsible agencies and trustee agencies, I believe the comments also apply properly to any local agency or individual organization that's responding to the notice of preparation. The guidelines say that the response at a minimum shall identify the significant environmental issues and reasonable alternatives and mitigation measures that need to be explored in the draft EIR. It goes on to say that a generalized list of concerns not related to the specific project shall not meet the requirements for a response. I see that there's a 5-page memo at places. This is the first that I've seen it. I don't know, maybe you got to see it this weekend. I certainly don't have to go opportunity before the meeting to go through all of these. And it's broken up into 3 sections that include the planning process, the alternative description, and the environmental impacts. And I would ask you, when you go through that letter, to see the extent to which it does comply with the guidelines definition of what a response should be, and does not include the things that it says are not proper response. And to repeat, it is the significant environmental issues and reasonable alternatives and mitigation measures that need to be explored in the draft EIR. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would staff like to?
Good evening, council members. Hillary Gittleman, the planning director. And as Mr. Borak mentioned, there is an App Places memo, or actually it was distributed on Friday and put on the website on Friday, a draft letter. And I wanted to thank the committee for their comments at the last meeting. We tried to take those comments that you made at the last meeting with the ideas that were already included in that staff report and amplify upon them to get to this draft letter. I also wanted to thank Adina Levin for her help as we put this together, just to make sure that we were on the right track with some of these things. I just don't have personally the background that some of you do and that she does in this project. So I hope we gave you a draft that's a good starting place, and we're here this evening to take any comments or suggestions you have to finalize this so we can get it out in the council's packet this Thursday.
Great. You can lead us off on whatever questions are coming. Okay.
I just want to confirm, this letter we got at place is exactly what we got last week.
That's right.
Okay.
It went out on Friday.
Thanks.
So with that, I'll open it up to colleagues for any questions or comments.
So in no particular order, I just made some notes on the letter. I thought if it doesn't come out enough, I thought we should request an analysis of the impact of the Caltrain schedule and the potential for bunching of cars depending on how the passing tracks are situated. Is that clear?
Yeah, I think it's in there already, but we can make sure it's more clearly stated.
And then before point 4, where we talk about the working group, I thought that was the point where before we say that, we should reiterate our desire for CSS as the proper approach. So not that we're necessarily condoning the working group approach, we prefer CSS, but if we're going to have a working group, then we'd like to be able to submit some recommendations for people to be on that group.
If it would be okay, do you think I could make that point in item number 3? Just because that point about the working group is kind of specific to that process, but I'd be happy to add that to item number 3.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then I actually want to ask my colleagues, but I thought before we actually got into these points, it might be worth reiterating our official position in general about high-speed rail from the staff report. The 2 bullet points that we think that it fundamentally contradicts the measure that the voters approved and that the business plan doesn't meet the requirements either. And then on point 7, where it starts to talk about the 42 grade separations, 2 points. One was Herb Borak's point about seeing an estimate of the cost and time to do the grade separations. And then also, if we can word it properly, I'd like to see some comparison again of the investment in Southern California where they're doing some trenching and grade separations versus the peninsula route. So the level of detail in the EIR did not seem at all comparable to the level of detail in the Southern California leg. And they're working on that now before they're working on high-speed rail. And then continuing on point 9, we mentioned the Hatchmont-McDonald study for Charleston and Meadow. but we don't mention Churchill and Alma. And so I think we should mention those as well. On point 14, I wonder if there was a typo here. It says we should reconsider the decision to access San Francisco by using the Caltrain alignment rather than using the East Bay. Shouldn't that be flipped around?
Yeah, thank you, that's a mistake.
Okay. And then on point 24, the last sentence there, we say included but not limited to El Palo Alto. I thought we might want to explain what that is, the city's namesake, 300-year-old redwood tree or whatever the description is. And those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Anybody else want? Pat?
Shot. So first, just following up on Tom's comment on El Palo Alto, it's actually, I believe, listed under state landmarks as the number 2 landmark in California, if I'm recalling correctly, under some list. So it has greater prominence than just that we care about it. Second, at the local policymaker group, when there was a request made last week for an extension on the comment period for the scoping of the EIR, EIS, the High-Speed Rail Authority representatives insisted that any extension on the EIS was solely the discretion of the FRA and that we should go to the FRA to request that extension. While I appreciate that that's probably technically accurate, I was pretty surprised, and others were as well, that the authority who has been the lead agency on this going back to the prior EIR, EIS on the Peninsula Rail Program and now, and all their documents list them as the lead agency on that, that they wash their hands of any role, even what's more responsibility in getting an extension. So nevertheless, we'll want to forward any request for an extension directly to the FRA and have a separate letter to them.
Yeah, thank you, Councilmember or Mayor Burt. I actually debated whether the letter should be addressed to both Mr. McLaughlin at High Speed Rail, but also to Ms. Perez at the Rail Administration, and I put her as a CC, but we could change that and address the letter to both parties, if that would be your preference.
Yeah, it now seems like that's probably the best case.
Happy to do that.
Okay. And then in addition to impacts of passing tracks on Caltrain operation, there's also the issue of whether an absence of level boarding will hinder the ability of a blended system to operate fully, and whether that would be a negative environmental impact. And of course, are we also framing each of these in terms of our alternatives?
I'm sorry, we make a number of comments in the alternatives description, so starting at number 8 about these issues, and I think we did get that one that you brought up at the last meeting about the level boarding. It's number 10.
Okay.
So please tell me if that captures your thought or if we should expand that. And then the passing tracks are dealt with in number 11 and 12.
So when I look at 10, I think it says impact on high-speed rail, but actually our concern is principally impact on Caltrain.
That's 10, right?
Yeah. And I didn't go through the letter to make sure that our other concerns, so is there I had my notes, but I didn't track them against the letter. So is there a number that identifies construction impacts, both in general and then on the grade separations?
It will take me a moment to find where we talk about that. I mean, we can certainly do more. I like the way that Mr. Borak's comment letter framed that issue, so we could even add that thought about the impacts of construction of grade separations on the timing if they precede high-speed rail, and on the operations of Caltrain and high-speed rail if they follow.
If they are done after either Caltrain is launched as electrified system or after high-speed rail is launched as a blended.
Right,
Yes, and that's.
right. I'd be happy to add that.
Yeah, and in the local policymaker group meeting, this came up as well, and they were talking, the High-Speed Rail Authority was talking about essentially doing grade separations approximately in blocks of 5, and we raised the question of if you were able to do that many at a time, how many year period would it take to do a set of grade separations? And I think it's probably a 2 to 3 year period. Those are major construction projects. And so then, depending on whether is it 42 in the system?
Yes.
And it's not assumed that all grade crossings will remain open in the long term. There may be some closures where, particularly further up the peninsula, low-volume grade crossings exist. Nevertheless, if we're thinking in the neighborhood of 40 grade crossings times 3 years, that's a lot of years to get them all in. And then just on CSS, I think we may want to actually put it as its own number, and that we want to really go into an explanation of why having CSS or an equivalent multi-stakeholder group has been demonstrated as a process that is likely to more effectively identify alternatives and reconcile competing interests and result in, if a project does come forward, that it will be a better project, less likely to be exposed to legal challenge as well. And this was one of the arguments that was also made at the LPMG, is that this approach is penny wise, dollar foolish, because it's going to more likely result in a project that will be challenged. And then, I don't know, maybe there still is a basis to include this last thing in this letter, which is about the rush timing. When they came forward with this schedule last September, I question a great deal why they were proposing the schedule that they had, which was even more aggressive than this one. And the answer finally emerged that they expected within a month or so to receive their expressions of interest from private investors, and that they thought that they would have strong investment responses from the private sector that would potentially accelerate construction of this segment. The opposite happened, and then since then they've had their primary ongoing funding source of the cap and trade dollars. Really, two things have happened. The legislative analyst, the legislature's attorney, clarified that that the current cap and trade legislation does not qualify them for ongoing funding beyond 2020. And so that's a pretty definitive position. And then last week, the cap and trade auctions came in at 2% of anticipation, and the entire cap and trade system is now in really disarray for not only this project, but for other transportation projects that were hoping on that as a funding source. So their belief that they had enough dollars to go forward on the schedule that they are still claiming in their business plan is now seriously undermined. And their hope and belief that they would have additional private sector dollars has been refuted by the responses from the private sector. So I think we should, in some concise way, include in our argument that the timeline does not need to be this aggressive, these two changes that have occurred since they put this schedule out there. So these are changes in just the last couple of months, and it really undermines the premises of their schedule.
Good.
So they got 2% is what you said of the
Yeah.
funds that they expected?
I'm sorry, Mayor Byrd, if you could help me just identify, so make the point after item number 3, which goes into this, why rush, and we sent you a letter on this.
Well, I would
Then we'd
say
have-
3 is, let's see, we'd have a new 4 that would be all about CSS or
Okay.
equivalent multi-stakeholder process.
Okay,
And then I thought it was 4 that, oh, no, I'm sorry. Yes, 3. So add on to 3
okay,
the issues about that their timeline was based upon anticipated funding on 2 levels that now have failed to materialize.
okay,
At
thank
least
you.
for the time being.
Okay, so if you could just help me out. Remind me, when we send a letter like this, it's a comment on the EIR, EIS, and response to NOI
Scoping.
and scoping.
It's the scope.
So it's the scoping letter. So what are their legal obligations to us to respond? Can they ignore the letter? Do they have to address each comment, or how does this work?
Their obligation is to consider our comments as they prepare the draft environmental documents. They won't respond
So the-
explicitly to our letter.
So they don't have to respond to each individual comment. It's unlike on an EIR when you have to respond to
That's
the
right.
comments.
That's right,
So they just read this and take it into consideration, and that's it?
that's right.
Okay.
And it gives them some idea of how we will be looking at the draft EIR, EIS, and what our comments might look like if they don't address these.
And their legal liability.
Right,
They don't.
if they don't. Correct. Okay. So you heard a bunch of comments from different people. Could you just go through this letter of what comments, what we're changing and what we're not changing from the letter, and what we're putting in, just so I understand before we vote what we're talking about? Voting on.
Sure. And please help me, those of you who have commented, if I missed something. First and foremost, we're going to address the letter both to the High-Speed Rail Authority, but also to the Federal Rail Administration, the environmental specialist who's identified as the contact in the Federal Register. Then I think Councilmember Du Bois suggested that we articulate this, at least a couple points from the city's official position, and that's something I'd really like the whole committee's guidance on.
So I don't think I support that, and that's part of the reason I want to go. The reason is I think we're sort of beyond that at the moment, and I don't think it's helpful to the process, so I would not vote for that.
Okay, so that's a question, or maybe not, we won't do
Right,
that.
I mean, the
Then-
rest of you may, but let's move on. I want to
Yeah,
involve.
I was curious of the opinion, so do you mind if we just have you two weigh in, and then we can make a decision on that?
Well, I had the same concern, because this letter is supposed to be focused on the scope of the EIR and the EIS, and broader policy concerns not only arguably aren't pertinent here, but they could further, just consciously or not, undermine how we'll be viewed as a valid commenter if we just fold them into opposition to the project.
Sorry, so what you want to do is fold into this our general opposition, I mean, kind of what was in the staff memo, essentially, of...
Yeah, I was asking what you guys thought about that. I wasn't set one way or the other. mean, the second point was that the business plan doesn't meet the stated goals, which I guess we could word that as part of the EIR, but if you guys think it's not,
Yeah,
I mean, it's ridership, revenue, all that stuff.
I agree with the concerns, but I mean, I was going to ask when it came to me a couple concerns about the length of this letter as is. I don't know that we want to deviate too much.
Okay, thank you. So then, moving on, we've talked about adding a little bit to point number 3 about the fact that the schedule was justified by prospective funding that has since then not materialized, either from investors or from the cap and trade program. Then we talked about adding a new number 4 that would go into some more detail about the CSS or equivalent stakeholder process being shown to be a better way to identify alternatives, recognize competing interests, and result in a project that's a better project and less likely to be subject to legal challenge. Then we talked about adding, and I'll have to figure out where to do this, something about the grade separations, the cost and time associated with, that the EIR, EIS need to disclose the cost and time associated with evaluating the grade separations, whether they happen before and as part of high-speed rail, or whether they happen subsequent to high-speed rail, and what then, in that case, what the effects would be on high-speed rail and Caltrain service.
Just, if on number 4, which I think we skipped, I was suggesting that we wanted to, and maybe it doesn't belong in here, which is fine, but I'd like to recommend members for that working group.
Recommend members of the working group?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, so number 4 is talking about the working group. Is it appropriate for us to say, we'd like to propose potential members? Okay.
Sorry. The High-Speed Rail Authority has welcomed us proposing members. I just don't understand how it's a comment on the scope of the EIR.
I mean, it says the city wants to provide input. I mean, maybe it's enough the way it is. It's what it already says, but. Okay.
An EIR scope is something different from everything that we may have concerns about or want to comment on.
And then Hillary's last comment on grade subs, I think that would be 0.7, but.
Yeah.
So, also, as we go on, I'm concerned that when we do the scoping of this, it's fine if it's not appropriate, but I'm a little concerned about the fact that we don't talk at all about wanting them to scope out the tunnel when they do the grade separations. And as part of that, whether or not they should look at if freight trains were to run a 2% grade separation, or a 2% grade rather than what is 1% at the moment. And I think we should get that in here somewhere.
Yeah. I think we tried to include that in item number 9 at the end there, where we mentioned the Hatchmont McDonald work. So you should tell me if you don't think that's sufficient.
Can I?
It's the top of page 3.
So that's a really good point, and one that I had somehow omitted. So I think it goes more broadly even than Councilmember Scharf had stated, and that is they need to analyze the impact of freight on the corridor, variations of the current freight system and exclusion of freight, and what that might mean to alternatives, including trenching. So, for example, if we looked at 1% grade and then 2%, and 2% conceivably could be handled with freight in the future with a waiver. With no freight, it could potentially go to 3%.
Right. I would be in support of everything Councilmember Mayor Burt said.
We were back on number 7, so I got the point there about the grade separation cost and level of detail. Then the next change to the letter would be This one we just talked about in number 9, maybe amplifying that to say that they should analyze the impact of freight on the corridor and potential modifications of freight, the impacts on alternatives, including the ability to do this 2% separation. Then Councilmember Du Bois asked that we also mention our desires to grade separate Churchill and Alma, even though those weren't explicitly studied by Hatchmont McDonald, and we can do that.
And Pat also said no freight option,
The no freight option.
which means you wouldn't be running any freight on the corridor. That means you could go to 3%.
Yeah, I'm just not sure that that's a feasible alternative for them to consider. We can put it in, but I don't know that they have the ability to control. Actually, because the Federal Rail Authority is one of the party we're going to address this to, we can add it and see what they say.
So it's very possible that there would be a freight alignment that would not need freight south of Redwood City. For instance, if Dumbarton Rail was reopened and the freight service that exists today, a very strong argument can be made that it doesn't actually need to go down this far into San Jose. So whether freight would be eliminated from the whole corridor or from our segment, it is something that is being considered, and the fact that the FRA is supportive of retaining freight in principle doesn't mean that that's not an alternative.
Okay, I'm happy to add that to the letter.
And it's something that's been considered actually in this discussion going back to 2009.
And just to add, so I think, you mentioned freight in 9, and then I almost think this general impact on freight is a new point, maybe between 9 and 10.
Yeah, maybe we'll add a new item there. And then number 10, we're going to add Caltrain. So this is where we would address Councilmember Du Bois' comment about looking at the potential impact of the passing track on, this is the one about level boarding. We'll cover Caltrain as well as high-speed rail, and then in the next 2 points is where we'll capture.
Sorry, Hillary, can I just interrupt? Since I was going to speak to this when it came to me, but I might as well interject it at this point. So Pat, at the last meeting, brought up this example of, if there's somebody who holds up the train because they're having trouble getting on board, if they're, using a wheelchair or whatnot, and the impact that has on the entire kind of timing of the system, and then, the timing needs to match up perfectly with the passing tracks for the heights. Should we be a little more explicit or explain that situation a little more in this bullet point? I also have concerns about how long the letter is overall, so I'm not helping that. But I wonder if, just kind of describing the concern, if they didn't kind of connect the dots on this already, they might need us to be pretty explicit about it.
Yeah.
Okay, I'd be happy to expand on that point just to make sure they understand what our concern is. Okay. And then items 11 and 12 are about the passing track, and that's where we'd capture Councilmember Du Bois' comment about the concern about the bunching of cars. I mean, I think what we're trying to say is we need to understand what the impacts of the various passing track options would be on service, Caltrain service, and reliability. That's kind of what we're trying to get to in number 12.
Sorry.
Then item 14, I'll correct that typo where the Caltrain and East Bay alignments were reversed. Then the next comment I got was about point number 24, where we'll be explicit or expand on El Palo Alto as a resource.
So I know Mark hasn't gone yet. I have one other point that I think actually fits in somewhere around 10, 11, 12, but should we mention some need to look at the cumulative impacts of both electrification and high-speed rail and the timing of construction? Because I don't think we explicitly call that out anywhere. And it gets kind of, you were touching on it in terms of the order of construction of grade steps, electrification, high-speed rail. All three of those things is important.
So Caltrain modernization, high-speed rail, and grade separations.
The order and timing of those.
Yeah.
Right.
happy to include that or expand that point we did include here somewhere about cumulative impacts.
This is still, you're good? So I just had, a couple of my concerns have been addressed. I just had one other question, which is the last sentence, well, maybe two or three, but the last sentence of item number 7, I actually don't understand. And I don't know if I'm just reading it wrong. And it's, at the end we say something is long overdue, but I can't figure out what it is that is long overdue that we mentioned in that sentence. So if we can maybe just,
Yeah, or if the committee doesn't think this is a useful thought, we can strike it. The idea was to say, hey, a long time ago, we said we were going to study at least selected grade separations. We should have been deciding which those selected grade separations were, starting 2 years ago.
I see. I mean, I think I'm perfectly okay with making the point. Maybe just, yeah,
streamline it.
exactly.
I'd just break the sentence in two.
And then I think Pat's point about, if I recall correctly, the results of the cap and trade auction came out later that day after we had our high-speed rail meeting with Mr. Traposis. And it totally undercuts his argument of we need to finish this in a fast time frame so that we'll get third-party investment. There's no way third parties are going to invest in this at this stage until high-speed rail gets cleaned up. I mean, until cap and trade gets a little more certainty around it. And then also, Pat was mentioning that the Legislative Analyst's Office said the current cap and trade program only goes till 2020, and it'll have to be renewed. It's also still being determined whether or not that's a 50% plus one majority or a 2/3, which dramatically impact its likelihood of success based on, is it a fee or is it a tax? And there's a lawsuit right now happening with that. And so, I mean, I just don't know what world they're operating in where they think serious third-party investors would be interested in investing in this project, given all the uncertainty. It really undermines their credibility, I think, with the local agencies when they continue to insist on an accelerated time frame based on arguments that just hold no legitimacy. So I'd say feel free to be very pointed when you make that point. And I think, other than everything else that was discussed, those are kind of the main comments that I had. I guess on a macro level, is there a concern about the letter being too long or too detailed? I mean, are they going to, and maybe we don't really hope that, I mean, maybe we don't expect that they'll really take us seriously because they haven't taken much local community comment seriously up till now. For instance, we say in point 3, we have not received a response to this letter that we sent them, on January 25th. And I don't know if we should underline that or bold that or kind of emphasize our displeasure with that fact. But is there any concern that this is too long and we're just going to lose them from the start? It's tough because it's very complicated.
I don't know. I mean, I've been on the receiving ends of letters like this, and on one hand you go, oh my God, they're driving me crazy. But on the other hand, you're like, at least we know what their concerns are. We can do an analysis that is responsive to these issues. So,
okay. So it makes sense to err on the side of being comprehensive.
I don't think there's a downside.
Okay. Anybody else have any wrap-up comments, questions? No? So I think that's, and you guys feel pretty clear on?
I think I have what I need. What I'll do is prepare a revised letter on the mayor's letterhead. It'll be in the packet for the council's consideration on the consent agenda next Monday.
Great. Thank you very much. So that wraps up item number 1, and I know we want a little conversation.
We have to actually vote on it.
Oh. Is there, yeah? We don't have the final letter. I guess we're going to be voting on it at council.
How does it go on consent if we don't vote on it? I mean, not to be too.
No, that's a good point. So I guess I'll move that we approve the revised letter to be placed on consent on June 6th. Any questions, comments? I don't need to speak to it. Greg? No. All in favor? Aye. So that passes unanimously. And now moving on to future meetings and agendas, we just received an updated tentative future items sheet.
Yes, the one change that was made, Chair, members of the committee, is item B, items to be scheduled. On your meeting last week, made reference to wanting to discuss rail quiet zones, so we added that to the list, and we'll work with staff to identify appropriate time to bring that forward. In addition, just wanted to note for the committee's attention that at your last meeting, you discussed the Dumbarton Transportation Corridor studies, so we provided an at places related to that just simply provided some public documents that have been put together for correspondence to Samtrans from the City of Palo Alto expressing our interest in participating in the study. This was before it began, and also a recent PowerPoint presentation done by Samtrans staff on the study that provide a basic overview of the scope, the schedule, and the approach they're taking to that study.
Thank you very much. And so that was in reply to a member of the public who'd asked us to look into the idea of being a study partner to this study. The study partners are listed on slide 9 of the slide deck that's in the At Places memo, and as this was pointed out to me from staff, this pretty much includes the service providers and the funder are really the only study partners. And so it was Richard Brand from the public had reached out about this idea. I got back to him to get a little more clarity on what he was looking for. He sent a question to Samtrans, and as of 2 hours before the meeting, Samtrans hadn't replied in regards to how different kind of local agencies might participate in a more substantive way in this study. So we don't have a lot to go on right now, but this is kind of just flagging for possibly in the future, depending on if we get more information back from Samtrans on how Palo Alto might be a larger participant in the study and in the process. And once we learn that, then we can have a conversation about whether or not that makes sense. But without the first bit of information, it's hard to have the conversation.
So I'm still confused on this issue. So the notion is there's a citizen working group that they're putting together, or is it a liaison? I mean,
we're still finding out. I don't know if Tom.
If so, I mean, shouldn't it be a council member who is the liaison to something like that? I mean,
so I mean, we have no idea.
Yeah, my impression was it was a citizen working group, but we don't know. So
yeah, so this is Tom had brought this up at the last meeting. Richard Brand had emailed us about it. We're still in the information accumulation stage before we can actually make a decision policy-wise. Yeah, but it's a good question. Any other comments?
Not on that.
But under this item, future meetings and agendas?
Yes.
Yeah, go for it.
So at the last local policy maker group, there was an update on Caltrain grade crossing safety improvements, and these are things not exclusively quad gates, but along those lines. The problem was that they ranked the priority crossings based upon traffic volume and not traffic volume per lane or other design issues that make one grade crossing more problematic than another. So if I guess under their criteria, if a grade crossing had 2 lanes each direction, 4 lanes, and another grade crossing had 1 each direction, and the one with 4 lanes had 1 more car per hour, it would rank as being a higher problem grade crossing warranting safety improvements more than one that is more congested. And I think I had raised this with them 2 or 3 years ago when they made a first pass at this, and they came back with the same methodology, and it's just superficially flawed in its methodology. So I think that we need to formalize our objection to that methodology. So I'd like to agendize that at the next meeting.
Absolutely, and I think I caught that actually happened. That conversation happened at our last rail committee meeting, You go to too many meetings.
Okay.
And so, no, but it was a very good point, and they look like deer caught in headlights when you made the point. And clearly they hadn't given it enough thought, so I totally
Yeah, you're
agree
right.
that we should.
Right.
If I can just interject, I talked to the representatives of Samtrans at the meeting, and I think they heard the message. What they were presenting are the improvements that they're proposing at our 4 grade crossings. So however they prioritized, our grade crossings did end up on the list, and they presented in their PowerPoint and these are kind of low-level improvements at the crossings that they're currently.
I didn't think our 4 did make the list, all of them.
Well,
I thought only 2 did.
we can send the committee that PowerPoint again. I think that they're pretty minor improvements, but I think they did include something at all of our crossings.
So I agree that they're pretty minor, although the methodology would, if they don't change it, would be the one they'd use going forward for major improvements. If you look at this, I don't know, they're not number slides. They listed our 4 crossings, but they only listed Charleston as number 6 and Alma as number 9. Churchill is number 13 and East Meadow is number 18, and they were proceeding on the top 10.
That's my recollection. I can't remember if it was top 10, but I remember it was only 2 of them got into it.
And so I think they were covering the top item on every one in terms of improvements, but for the second 2, they weren't going to fund the additional improvements, I think.
Yep.
Any other questions on future meetings and agendas? All right, so with that, meeting's adjourned. Thank you.